The last talk in the Journey to the Sun series this year. So we've had a lot of excellent talks, and we've got one more excellent talk today. I would like to introduce our speakers, and actually I'm going to introduce the first speaker, and then I'm going to let him introduce our second speaker. So we'll be talking about understanding sun exposure, especially risks to military personnel, from a public health perspective. So Justin McDaniel is an associate professor in public health here at SIU. He's also has an adjoint appointment in the Dale and Deborah Smith Center for Alzheimer's Research and the CARE and the Department of Population Science, which I probably just mangled, so I apologize. So he's like filling a whole bunch of shoes. He's got a lot going on. And his scholarly interests center on social determinants of health among military servicemen and women. Okay, so they're going to share some of their insights with us, and I'll let you get us started. Okay.
Well, thank you for coming out to the talk today. My name is Justin, and I run the Veteran Lab here at SIU. The Veteran Lab is a research service and advocacy group focused primarily on the military service member and veteran population, particularly in the areas of educational support and healthy lifestyles. The varied and many exposures during military service have a deep and lasting effect on the lives of our honorable and distinguished service members. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story about a very special late veteran who inspired all of the work that we do in the lab. Kate Hendricks Thomas, was a Marine during the early 2000s and served on deployments to Iraq, during which she was exposed to burn pits. And she retired from the military around 2008 and went to college, earned her PhD, and became a professor. And I met her in 2016 when, as a department chair at a university in Charleston, South Carolina, she hired me as an assistant professor to work in her department. She was one of my earliest academic mentors, and she had a profound impact on my life and career trajectory. And she was brilliant, she was incredibly hardworking, and she was pivotal in helping me get my research program started. 2 years later, after I met her in 2016, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer due to her exposures in Iraq. And she passed away on April 5th, 2022, leaving behind her husband and son and a legacy of grit and resilience. Between her diagnosis and her death, she relentlessly advocated for women veterans, focusing primarily on legislation that would cover the cost of mammograms for women veterans who were exposed to toxic substances during their deployments. Although the VA at the time was very hesitant to connect veteran health issues to service-related exposures, her testimonies, including before Congress, led to Joe Biden signing the Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas Service Act into law in June of 2022, which expanded services for women veterans who were exposed to burn pits during their service. So it's my honor to speak about and work in response to her legacy and to more broadly support our veteran population in Southern Illinois and beyond. And so today we aren't discussing burn pit exposure, but we will be talking about another exposure that also has a very profound impact on the health of our nation's veterans. And so I'm excited to introduce Claire Hughes. She's a doctoral student working in the Veteran Lab. Her brilliance and hard work remind me a lot of Kate, actually, and so I'm enthused to allow her to talk to you about some of the background work that she's been doing on the intersection of sun exposure and military service. So Claire, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for your kind words. As he said, I'm Claire Hughes, and I'm a doctoral student working on my population health degree. And I am going to kind of just share with you what I've been researching in terms of skin cancer, sunburn, and its impact on our service members and veterans. Let's start by framing why this issue is so critical. Skin cancer isn't just a concern for the general population, it's the most frequently diagnosed cancer in the US military. Now, this tells us that sun exposure isn't just a personal risk, it's a significant occupational hazard for our service members. Think about the environment that they're in. Military personnel routinely face intense UV radiation, whether it's the desert heat, tropical deployments, or even high altitude conditions. The nature of their work often means unavoidable and prolonged exposure to the sun. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's also dangerous. This level of exposure directly elevates the risk for developing both melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancers. And that's not just a health issue, it's also a readiness issue. Skin cancer can affect individual health, but it also impacts the military's ability to maintain a healthy and deployable force. That's why a public health approach is so essential. We need to focus on prevention, early detection, and policy changes that prioritize the health of our service members. In this presentation, we'll delve into data examining the epidemiology of skin cancer in the military. We'll evaluate some current protection, importantly, propose evidence-based recommendations to mitigate risk and enhance readiness. Off to a good start. Okay. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm doing the dual screen thing here, so just shout if you can't see what I'm talking about. Happens every time I present. Now, to understand the overall impact, we have to start with our most common high-risk indicator, and that is sunburn. We're looking at nearly 12,000 clinically diagnosed sunburn cases over a 9-year period, but that's just what's captured through the medical system. Almost all of these are treated in ambulatory care, and the fact that 97% had only one recorded diagnosis suggests that underreporting is a major issue, and most sunburns probably never make it into the record. This crude incident rate sits at about 105 per 100,000, which is already significant for preventable conditions, especially when you consider the compound impact of even mild sunburns in terms of hydration, performance, and recovery. So certain groups are more impacted than others. We have women, non-Hispanic white service members, and especially our under 25 service members among those most impacted. We have seasonality that we can pinpoint in terms of sunburn incidents. 46% of cases occurred in June. We have 10 military installations accounting for 36% of all cases, and the 4 highest, Okinawa, San Diego, Fort Moore, and Fort Leonard Wood. We can even see occupational and branch-specific patterns when we dig deeper into the data. The Marine Corps shows the highest incident, followed closely by the Army. That tracks with what we know about outdoor exposure. These branches train and operate in field environments far more often and with greater intensity. Within those branches, certain occupational roles stand out. Infantry, engineering, and motor transport jobs involve prolonged periods outdoors, often in the heat and full sun. These are the folks doing the ruck marches. They're constructing in exposed environments or working in vehicles in the sun all day. Not surprisingly, the rates reflect that. On the other end of the spectrum, pilots and aircrew actually have some of the lowest recorded sunburn diagnosis. But I'll tell you, that doesn't mean they're in the clear. In fact, recent studies show that they have higher long-term cancer risks, especially melanoma. Likely contributors to this are cumulative UV exposure through cockpit glass, altitude-related factors, and underdiagnosed burns that don't show up in medical records. Even within branches, exposures can vary widely. Navy personnel, for example, can be stationed on ships or onshore bases, and their risk profile changes accordingly. So again, this isn't just about personal responsibility, it's a role-based risk that could and should shape prevention strategies, education, and supply planning. Here we're looking at a comparison between two surveillance periods, 2002 to 2013, 2014 to 2022. At first glance, this looks like good news. Clinically diagnosed sunburns dropped nearly 16% have dropped from over 19,000 to 12,000. But it's not quite that simple. The crude incidence rate dropped 16% from 124.8 to 105 per 100,000. That could mean reduced risk or better prevention, but we have to be cautious in interpreting that trend. One of the biggest changes at this time was the switch to the ICD-10 diagnostic coding. It introduced more detailed sunburn categories, including a brand new sunburn unspecified diagnosis. That makes it harder to compare the data across time. It may account for some of the shift. We also have dual diagnosis that we have to account for as well. We also see a big drop in the proportion of first-degree sunburns from 80% down to 54%, and a jump in second-degree sunburns, which doesn't necessarily mean that severity has changed. It may reflect better recognition, different coding practices, or the fact that mild cases just aren't making it into the medical records at all. And that brings us to underreporting. Most sunburns, especially the mild ones, don't always lead to a clinic visit, so they're not documented consistently. So while the numbers are helpful, they may not fully capture the true scale of sun exposure risk across the forest. Let's take a closer look at what the data tells us about the cancer risk itself and the occurrence. Non-melanoma skin cancer is now the leading cancer diagnosis among active duty military, particularly those in those high exposure roles like engineering, infantry, and outdoor field training sites. Perhaps more striking is the risk among aviation personnel. Remember, I mentioned they had the lowest occurrence of sunburn, but they have some of the highest incident rates and risk rates for cancer. According to the Department of Defense's 2023 Phase 1A cancer study, aircrew members faced an 87% higher risk of melanoma. That's likely due to high altitude UV exposure and potentially cosmic radiation. Ground support personnel too have a modest but significant increase. We can't ignore the long-term burden. Veterans, especially those with long or repeated deployments, are more likely to receive later stage melanoma diagnoses. Stage 3 and 4 cancers are harder to treat, they're more expensive to manage, and they carry worse prognosis. You might be wondering why we have more detailed data on sunburn incidents compared to skin cancer incidents. There are a few reasons for this. Sunburn is an acute and uncomfortable reaction, and this leads service members to seek medical attention promptly, resulting in more consistent and detailed reporting in medical records. Skin cancer, on the other hand, develops over years or even decades of cumulative UV exposure, might not be diagnosed until much later in a service member's career or even after they've left the military. This is really challenging to link specific cancer cases directly to military service and specific branches. Military health surveillance systems prioritize tracking acute conditions that impact immediate readiness. While skin cancer is important, MHS focus must prioritize conditions that require immediate medical intervention and affect a service member's ability to perform their duties. We often talk about the risks of sun exposure in terms of health impact, but the burden of skin cancer in the military is also deeply operational and financial. Over a 5-year period, $6 million for melanoma. These are not minor line items. They reflect significant resource allocation and strain on the health system. Another important dimension is where the care happens. While 61% of active duty care happens. While 61% of active duty cases are still managed within military treatment facilities, about 95% of care for retirees is being handled through civilian purchased care via TRICARE. That's a major shift away from direct care and one that has implications for cost, continuity, and in this case, data tracking. Finally, we can't lose sight of how this ties back to readiness. Untreated sunburns and delayed cancer diagnosis can pull service members out of the field, sometimes for extended periods. The later the stage of diagnosis, the more intensive and expensive the care becomes, and the longer someone is away from their unit. So we're not just dealing with that medical issue here, we're dealing with this as a readiness issue. So it's important to note sun protection is not just a matter of personal choice in the military. It's shaped by broader operational realities and sometimes structural barriers. Among surveyed science members, only 13% report using sunscreen regularly, and 87% report using it inconsistently or sporadically. That suggests it's not just about access, it's also about behavioral norms, competing demands, and perceptions of priority. Access itself is limited. Fewer than 30% report consistent availability, particularly during deployments where resupply can be difficult and extreme conditions can reduce product effectiveness. Training represents another missed opportunity. Despite known risks, sun safety isn't consistently included in early training or field briefings, which limits long-term awareness. Operational priorities understandably come first, but that can make prevention harder to maintain. Time constraints, gear limitations, and the perception of sunscreen as non-essential all play a role. Logistical barriers also complicate things. Sunscreen may not be on packing lists, it can degrade in high heat, and remote deployments make resupply challenging. Leadership plays a key role, but they're navigating multiple demands. When sun safety isn't built into broader operational priorities, it can fall through the cracks, not due to lack of concern, but due to competing responsibilities. And at the end of the day, protection is a systems issue. Supporting consistent prevention efforts means aligning training, logistics, and communication strategies with the realities of military operations, one where the mission will always come first. That brings us to what's currently in place in terms of gear and where limitations still show up. So military gear does provide some baseline protection, things like uniforms, hats, sunglasses, and when available, sunscreen. But there are important limitations to what the gear actually offers in terms of UV protection. One major issue is that most standard uniforms have not been UV tested or labeled with UPF ratings. So while service members may assume they're protected, they often have no clear information about how much sun exposure their gear is actually blocking. And not all fabrics are created equal. UV protection varies on things based like fiber types, with polyester typically offering more protection than cotton, plus factors like the tightness of the weave, whether the fabric is wet, how faded or worn it is, and even the color. All of these influence how effective that uniform is ultimately going to be. These differences really matter in high exposure environments like deserts or flight lines. A lot of the materials and uniform pieces that would otherwise protect service members have to be, are not used because of working in areas where they can be caught in machinery and in engines, further exposing these service members to UV rays. Another gap is the training. Most service members don't receive formal instruction on how to assess the UV protection, and they're left to assume that their uniform is doing the job, when in reality, that may not be the case. And Lastly, while there are these options out there, there are UPF-rated uniforms, wide-brim sun hats. They're not wildly adopted. That's largely due to inconsistent policies and supply chain challenges. Some units allow them, others don't. Even when they're approved, they may not be easy to get through standard channels. So while tools exist, structural barriers still limit their consistent use and availability. But a public health perspective on this issue looks beyond gear and behavior. It considers the full continuum of prevention, including screening and early detection. Right now, there's no standardized DoD-wide skin cancer screening protocol. Routine annual exams do not consistently include skin checks or UV risk assessments, and dermatology referrals are usually reactive, triggered by symptoms, rather than used as a preventative measure. Access to dermatology services varies by installation, and as a result, many diagnoses happen only after symptoms have become advanced or concerning enough to get that service member to a dermatologist. And these gaps don't end with active duty. Among veterans, only about 31% report ever receiving a full-body skin exam by a healthcare provider. 23% of veterans deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan report being made very aware of their risk for skin cancer during service. Screening rates are highest amongst those with certain characteristics. So those who are older, more educated, have fairer skin types, and already have proactive sun safety behaviors and access to TRICARE are more likely to be proactive to seek voluntary skin screenings and take charge of it before it becomes a problem. So this paints a clear picture. Without routine risk communication or excessive proactive screening, both during and after service, opportunities for early detection are being missed. And from a public health standpoint, that's a gap worth addressing. So, if we know that screening and early detection are falling through the cracks, both during active service and post-discharge, what can we do about it? From a public health standpoint, there are real opportunities to move the needle. First, we make screening routine. Full-body skin exams could be integrated into annual health assessments, especially for service members in high-risk roles or environments. That simple step could shift us from a reactive to preventative care. We can also improve field awareness, adding sun risk screening tools and self-check education into field readiness briefings or deployment prep. Certain groups at higher risk should be prioritized, those air crew, that aviation support, those outdoor intensive roles. Older service members and retirees would fall into this category and would benefit from targeted screening protocols. Technology can also help fill this gap. Teledermatology and mobile apps could extend dermatology support to remote or understaffed installations. There's also a role for provider training. Primary care and field medics are often the first line of care, and equipping them to recognize high-risk lesions and refer early could make a big difference. And finally, tracking matters. If UV exposure and skin exam results were built into readiness metrics and electronic health records, we'd have better data and better accountability for long-term prevention. Looking across everything we've covered, it's clear that sun exposure is more than just a personal risk, it is an occupational hazard. We've seen the burden play out in multiple ways: high rates of sunburn, elevated skin cancer in certain roles, and gaps in prevention and early detection. These challenges aren't about a lack of effort. I want to make that clear. They reflect the complex environment service members operate in, and they're competing demands with the demands that they're managing. Protective strategies like sunscreen gear and routine checks are available, but they're not always accessible or emphasized or integrated into the flow of training and care. And while many service members are navigating UV exposure daily, consistent risk communication and screening still aren't built into standard protocols. And that right there, that's where the opportunity lies. We have practical tools, from improving education to expanding access, to aligning screening with annual assessments, but bringing these efforts together can make sun protection part of readiness culture, not a separate task. It's a chance to protect health, preserve operational strength, and reduce long-term costs, both human and financial, for those who we serve. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions you have. Thank you for being a good audience and sticking in there with me. Navigating the two screens was a little bit more challenging than I anticipated, so. And if you don't have any questions, that's fine too.
All right, so I'm going to bring the mic around for as people have questions.
Thank you. So for the non-heliophysicists in the room like myself and for the astrophysicists and heliophysicists, we're in a solar maximum, right? This year we're approaching, and Dr. Brevik is shaking her head. She's saying I'm on track. Have you seen a correlation to research interests in the military or other professionals in this type of work? And obviously you're here, so the answer is yes for you, I know, but what's the rest of the field how they're dealing or relating to studies during the solar maximum?
Well, I will say this, there's not enough research being done. A lot of the data that I found, came from military reports themselves, memorandums, cancer studies. So the academic side of this, where we are looking specifically at military and sun cancer, sunburn, sun damage, there's a lot of room there, a lot of it. There's even more room, I would say, in terms of what protective gear we could be using and aren't. That was one of the hardest pieces of information for me to find as I was preparing for this. Because for obvious reasons, there's not going to be a lot of specs out there on what gear they're being issued. But there are areas there that we can explore as academics, as scientists, in order to better support what they're doing. Did that answer your question? A lot of gaps in the literature. A lot more work to do.
Okay, well, I have a question. Does the data include the servicemen and women who are serving with NASA, right? The ones who are serving as astronauts, for example, who get a lot of additional radiation exposure?
That is a very good question, and actually one that I went down several rabbit holes to try and prepare for. It was hard enough to find the data that I did, and I was only able to find limited data outside of that, and it was for the Coast Guard. So the answer is no. They aren't tracking that in the DoD or any other reports related to this. And they should be. If you look at that, the air servicemen rates of cancer, the risk is there.
It's just a small sample size, too. So.
Yeah, that's a lot of work to be done.
So we were saying our